I have been flying for work for almost 12 years. I am what the airlines call a frequent flyer, the kind of person who has a dedicated phone number to call, who knows which airport lounges have decent coffee, and who has learned, sometimes the hard way, that air travel requires a very specific kind of patience. You have to be patient with delays, with cramped seats, with recycled air and screaming toddlers and the man in 14B who insists on reclining his seat the full 2 inches the moment the wheels leave the ground. I have made my peace with almost all of it. I travel with noise-canceling headphones, a neck pillow I paid too much for, and the firm understanding that airplane discomfort is temporary and the destination is worth it. What I have never learned to be patient with is entitlement. And on a Tuesday morning flight from Chicago O'Hare to Seattle, I met a woman who made me rethink every peaceful boundary I had ever set for myself on an aircraft. My name is Claire. I am 38 years old. I work in regulatory compliance for a mid-sized pharmaceutical company, and I had been in Chicago for 4 days attending a conference that had run 2 days longer than expected due to a scheduling conflict with the keynote speakers. I was exhausted in the particular way that comes not from physical exertion but from 4 straight days of professional performance, of being on, of networking, of nodding thoughtfully at PowerPoint presentations and making small talk over rubbery chicken at banquet dinners. All I wanted was to get home to Seattle, to my apartment, to my cat named Gerald, who would be waiting at the door with that particular brand of feline passive aggression that passes for affection. I had booked my ticket 6 weeks in advance. I had selected my seat at the time of booking for a window seat in the first row of the main cabin, just behind business class. I chose it deliberately. The extra legroom. The proximity to the front of the plane, so I could deplane quickly. The window, so I could lean against the wall and sleep. It was a very intentional choice, and I had paid a seat selection fee on top of my ticket price to secure it. I am telling you all of this because it matters. Every detail of what I did to get that seat matters, because what happened next was a direct confrontation with someone who believed that what other people had carefully arranged for themselves was simply available to be taken. I arrived at my gate 40 minutes before boarding. I got a coffee from the little cafe across the concourse, found a seat near the windows, and watched planes taxi across the tarmac in the gray morning light. Chicago in November is not a place that encourages lingering outdoors, and the gate area had that particular hum of people who are all doing the same thing, waiting, wishing they were already somewhere else, scrolling their phones, dozing in chairs with their heads tilted back at uncomfortable angles. When my boarding group was called, I gathered my carry-on and my laptop bag, joined the line, scanned my boarding pass, and walked down the jetway. The flight attendant at the door greeted me with the kind of smile that is warm but slightly practiced, the one that means she has been doing this since 5 in the morning and has already resolved 2 minor crises. I smiled back, tucked myself into the flow of boarding passengers, and made my way to row 4. Seat 4A was occupied. I stopped in the aisle and looked at the seat number on the overhead bin, then at the woman sitting in my seat, and then back at the seat number. There was no ambiguity. The bin said 4, the letter above the window said A, and the woman sitting there was not me. She was somewhere in her early 60s, I would guess. Well-dressed in the way that communicates an awareness of being well-dressed, pressed linen trousers, a silk blouse, a structured handbag sitting on her lap like a small dog. Her silver hair was cut in a precise bob that probably costs more per session than my monthly gym membership. She had the reading glasses of someone who has decided that reading glasses are an accessory rather than a necessity. She was settled in with the completeness of someone who had been there for hours, her jacket draped over the armrest, her tote bag tucked under the seat in front of her. I said, very politely, "Excuse me, I think you might be in my seat." She looked up from her phone with an expression I can only describe as the face of someone who has been mildly inconvenienced by the existence of other people for their entire life. "I'm sitting here," she said, as though that settled it. As though the fact of her presence made it her seat. "I understand," I said, keeping my voice level, "but I have 4A. I selected it at booking." I showed her my boarding pass on my phone. The seat number was right there. 4A, Claire Merritt. Chicago O'Hare to Seattle. She glanced at my phone with the specific brand of disinterest that communicates contempt without the effort of expressing it directly. "I prefer the window," she said. "I get motion sick if I'm not by the window." You can sit in my seat. She gestured vaguely toward the aisle, as though she were offering me something generous. I want to pause here and say that I understand the challenge of motion sickness. I genuinely do. I have family members who struggle with it. It is real, it is unpleasant, and it deserves accommodation. But the way to address motion sickness on a plane is to book a window seat, or to request assistance from the airline, not to simply take someone else's assigned seat and tell them to go sit somewhere else, as though they are an inconvenience to be redirected. I'm sorry, I said, and I was still being very calm, very reasonable, the kind of calm that comes from 12 years of professional experience in which losing your composure is never the right move. I specifically chose and paid for the seat. I'd really like to sit in it. She looked at me with an expression that shifted from disinterest into something sharper. I have been flying for 40 years, she said. I always sit by the window. I need to sit by the window. You look young and healthy. Just sit in 4B. It's not a big deal. I looked at 4B. 4B was the middle seat. It is always the middle seat, isn't it? The seat that no one wants, the seat that is wedged between two strangers, the seat with no wall to lean on and no aisle to pivot toward. I had not paid a seat selection fee to sit in the middle seat. I'm going to need to ask you to move, I said. I'll get a flight attendant if necessary. Oh, for heaven's sake, she said, and the tone she used, I cannot fully describe it, but it was the tone of someone who is accustomed to small inconveniences being smoothed away by other people making themselves smaller. It was the tone of someone who has spent decades expecting the world to accommodate them without the effort of arranging that accommodation themselves. A flight attendant appeared at my elbow. She was young, maybe 25, with the composure of someone who has been trained to de-escalate situations that are not actually her fault. Is there a problem? She asked, in that perfectly neutral way that is designed to suggest that the situation is entirely solvable and no one needs to escalate. I explained, very calmly, that the woman in the seat had my assigned seat and was asking me to take her middle seat instead. I showed my boarding pass again. The flight attendant turned to the woman. Ma'am, can I see your boarding pass? The woman produced her phone with a sigh that managed to communicate that this was all deeply beneath her. Her boarding pass showed seat 4C, the aisle seat, row 4. She had an aisle seat. She had left her own perfectly serviceable assigned seat to take mine, simply because she preferred the window. Ma'am, the flight attendant said, with a particular careful kindness that is a professional skill, your assigned seat is 4C. This passenger has 4A. I know what my seat is, the woman said. I'm explaining that I need the window for medical reasons. Surely this young woman can accommodate me. I'm sorry, the flight attendant said. Passengers need to sit in their assigned seats. I'm going to have to ask you to return to 4C. The woman looked at the flight attendant for a long moment. Then she looked at me. And then she said something that I still think about, not because it was shocking. I have encountered entitled people before, but because of the sheer unbothered confidence of it. She said, "This is ridiculous. I'll speak to the captain." She said it the way you might threaten to speak to a manager, except she said it about the captain of a commercial aircraft, as though the captain of the aircraft had nothing better to do than arbitrate her window seat dispute. The flight attendant maintained her composure admirably. You're welcome to speak with any member of the crew, she said. But right now, I need you to move to your assigned seat, so we can complete boarding. There was a pause. Behind me in the aisle, several passengers had backed up slightly, doing the thing people do when they don't want to appear to be watching something dramatic but absolutely are. I could feel the collective attention of the boarding queue. The woman moved. She did it with the theatrical reluctance of someone who is performing displeasure for an audience, shifting her jacket and her tote bag with a series of pointed sighs, settling into 4C with the energy of someone who has been profoundly wronged. I sat down in 4A, my seat, the seat I had booked and paid for, and I put my bag in the overhead bin and I sat down. The flight attendant gave me a small, sympathetic look and moved on down the aisle. I thought it was over. I put my headphones in. I got out my phone to finish reading an article I had started the night before. I was prepared to spend the next 4 hours in a state of peaceful, deliberate ignorance of the woman in 4C. But the woman in 4C was not finished. For the first 10 minutes of the boarding process, she was quiet. But as the plane filled up and the flight attendants began their pre-departure preparations, I became aware that she had started talking. Not to me. To the flight attendant who passed by, to the man who settled into Furby beside her, to anyone within range. I had my headphones in, but they were not noise-canceling enough to fully block the particular carrying quality of her voice. She was explaining, to anyone who would listen, that she had a medical condition, that she had been flying for 40 years, that in her experience, the airline used to have much better customer service, that she had been treated very poorly, that the young woman, me, had been rude to her. I took a breath. I focused on my article. I reminded myself that I was going home to Gerald and my own bed, and that none of this would matter in 6 hours. Then a flight attendant, a different one, older, with the particular authority of someone who has been with the airline for a long time, came to row 4 and crouched down beside 4C. I slipped one headphone off. "Ma'am," this flight attendant said, quietly but clearly, "I understand you've expressed some concerns about your seating. I want to let you know that we've noted your preference for the window for future flights, and I'll be happy to see if there are any available window seats elsewhere on the plane once we've completed boarding. But I also want to be direct with you. What I'm hearing from the crew is that you were asked to leave a seat that wasn't assigned to you, and that you've been making comments about other passengers that are creating a difficult environment. I'd like to ask you to let this go." The woman straightened. "I want to speak with the captain," she said again, with the same unbothered certainty as before. "I have a medical condition, and my needs were not accommodated." The flight attendant held her gaze for a moment. "I'll pass your request along," she said. And she moved away. I put my headphone back in. Here is where the story shifts into something I did not expect. About 5 minutes before the door was scheduled to close, when the last few passengers were finding their seats and the flight attendants were doing their final checks, something happened that I have never seen in 12 years of flying. The cockpit door opened, and the captain came out. He was tall, somewhere in his 50s, with the particular bearing of someone who is very accustomed to being in charge of large, complicated situations. He was in full uniform. He looked around the cabin with the calm of someone who is not hurrying, which somehow made the moment more significant. He walked to row 4. He crouched down beside the woman in 4C, the way you crouch down when you want to have a private conversation in a public space, and he spoke to her in a voice low enough that I could not hear what he said. But I could see his face. And the woman's face. His face was composed, professional, and completely without apology. Her face went through several stages. First, the expression of someone who has gotten what they asked for and is preparing to be gratified. Then something more complicated. Then something that looked, if I am being honest, a little bit like the face of someone who has just realized they overestimated their leverage. He spoke to her for perhaps 2 minutes. She said several things. He listened to all of them with the same expression, and then he said something else. And then he stood up. He paused at my seat on his way back to the cockpit. "I'm sorry for any inconvenience, ma'am," he said to me, in the easy way of someone who manages situations like this regularly. "We appreciate your patience." I said, "Thank you, Captain." And he went back into the cockpit and closed the door. I never found out exactly what he said to her. But I can tell you what happened next, which is that the woman in 4C was almost entirely silent for the rest of the boarding process. She accepted a glass of water from the flight attendant with a brief thank you. She did not make any further comments about the young woman in 4A. She looked out the window of her aisle seat, which she did not have to do, since there was a perfectly good window in 4A, which is to say that I noticed she had never actually needed the window for motion sickness. She simply wanted it. As the plane pushed back from the gate and we taxied toward the runway, I allowed myself a moment of something that was not quite triumph. It is too small a word for something that was also, underneath the satisfaction, genuinely wearying, but was close to it. The recognition that sometimes things work out the way they should. That sometimes the straightforward and correct thing is actually the thing that happens. We took off into the gray Chicago morning. I watched the city fall away beneath us, the grid of streets and the flat, glittering surface of the lake, and then we were in the clouds and there was nothing to see, and I put both headphones back in and returned to my article. The flight to Seattle takes about 4 hours and 15 minutes on a direct route. I slept for 2 of them. The woman in 4C read a book. At one point a flight attendant came around with the snack cart, and we both accepted small bags of pretzels, without incident. The man in 4B slept through most of the flight with his mouth slightly open, which I found quietly endearing. When we landed at Seattle-Tacoma, I stood up to retrieve my bag from the overhead bin, and the woman in 4C also stood up. We were briefly in very close proximity in the way that happens when people are disembarking from an airplane, and the aisle is full of people pulling down bags and putting on jackets and collecting their scattered belongings.
She did not look at me.
I did not look at her. And then the aisle cleared, and I walked off the plane. I have thought about that flight a lot since it happened. Not obsessively, but regularly, in the way that particular moments of human interaction tend to resurface when you're sitting in a quiet room or waiting for coffee to brew. I think about it because it crystallized something for me that I had known for a long time, but had not quite named. There is a certain kind of person who moves through the world operating on the assumption that the structures and systems that everyone else navigates, the assigned seat, the boarding process, the queue, the rule, do not apply to them with the same force they apply to everyone else. Not because these people are malicious, exactly. Sometimes they are. But often they are simply people who have spent so long having things arranged around their preferences that the idea of not getting what they want feels like an injustice rather than just a fact of living among other people. What strikes me, still, is not the woman taking my seat. That kind of thing happens. What strikes me is her certainty. Her absolute, unbothered certainty that her preference, not a documented medical need, not an emergency, just a preference, entitled her to rearrange the arrangements other people had made for themselves. And the thing about certainty of that kind is that it tends to work, a lot of the time, because other people are conflict-averse. Because it is easier to give up the thing you wanted than to stand in an airplane aisle and calmly, repeatedly insist on your right to it. I have done the easier thing many times. I have given up my seat and my place in line, and my rightful hold on things that were mine, because the path of least resistance was simply to move aside. This time I didn't, and the flight attendant didn't. And somewhere in the chain of crew communication, the situation escalated, or perhaps descended, depending on your perspective, to the point where the captain of the aircraft came out of his cockpit 5 minutes before departure to have a conversation with a woman about her behavior. I am not naive enough to think that this always happens. Usually it does not. Usually the entitled person gets the window seat and the accommodating person gets the middle seat and everyone moves on, and the world continues to reward the people who demand the most while inconveniencing the people who ask for the least. But not always. Sometimes the flight attendant holds the line. Sometimes the captain comes out of the cockpit. Sometimes the structures that are supposed to work actually work, and the person who arranged everything properly and asked politely and refused to be moved gets to sit in the seat they booked and watch the clouds and go home. When I got off the plane at Seattle-Tacoma, I walked through the terminal with my carry-on rolling behind me, and I bought myself another coffee, even though it was already afternoon and I knew it would probably keep me up too late. I figured I had earned it. I took the light rail home. Gerald was at the door when I got there, looking at me with the expression that cats use when they are deeply relieved you are back, but intend to express this solely through indifference. I sat down on the kitchen floor and let him walk across my lap, and I thought about how glad I was to be home, and how glad I was that I had not moved to the middle seat, and how the window in my own living room showed a perfectly good view of the Seattle skyline, which I had not paid a seat selection fee for at all. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was, in fact, exactly what I needed.